philosophy, progressive truth, present truth, and its positions on creeds. We had understood that truth unfolds itself. Joseph Bates, James White came out of the Christian Connection Church. The Christian Connection Church, among other things, was geared towards a restorationist mindset. They wanted to restore the church back to its primitive Christianity, to restore lost truths that had been lost sight of. And they begin to include things such as baptism by immersion instead of dipping, and different things of that nature. And this carried over into the post-Depression, the disappointment after the Millerite Movement in 1844 with the development of the Sabbath. Sabbath was present truth, and as God would unfold. We talked about progressive truth, how truth would be progressive, but today's, as it would progress, it wouldn't make yesterday's truth obsolete. It would build upon it. One of the things that was probably fits nicely into that puzzle of progressive truth is our understanding of the sanctuary, what we refer to within Adventism as the sanctuary doctrine. Now, normally when we talk about the sanctuary doctrine, some people think of the tabernacle in the wilderness. That is the study of the tabernacle. That is not the sanctuary doctrine. That's a tool to help us understand the sanctuary doctrine. The sanctuary doctrine is specifically Daniel chapter 7, 8, and 9. It has to do with judgment, receive the 2300 days, the 70-week prophecy. We understand it culminating in 1844, and the point is, what relevance does it have today? 20 years ago, when a lot of this was blowing up with Desmond Ford and the issues concerning the investigative judgment, ministers of the Adventist church would stand up in groups and make a statement such as, what relevance is 1844 to me today? After all, if we're ministers, if you're a minister, what's your key program? What's the most important thing that you're really concerned about as a minister? Preaching the gospel, saving souls. So what does the judgment in this 1844 have to do with me, and have to do with our movement? And that simply just shows, one, a lack of understanding of where we came from, and would have to show a lack of understanding of the message that we have as a people in context to our present time. That's what we're going to cover in the next week. Just what is that message? Now, if you go to the end of the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, we see the Great Commission. Everybody's familiar with the Great Commission, I hope. If you not read those last verses, go is the verb. And as you are going, make disciples. Duplicate yourself. Teach, baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. The Great Commission is to give the gospel news. Salvation, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And every church has that. If you call yourself a Christian, and I don't care what church you go to, if you're a Roman Catholic or you're a Jehovah's Witness, if you call yourself a Christian, that's our mission. And so the big question then, if that's our mission, why Adventism? What makes us distinct and unique? What is our mission and message so different and unique that would cause us to be a different movement, that would cause us to organize as a separate denomination? That we will unfold in the next week. And so as they begin to unfold this understanding, using this philosophy, they knew that the Bible would begin to reveal things and change their position. Where they may be today, they may not be tomorrow. Very progressive were our founders. And so they wanted to use the Bible only as its creed. Understanding how creeds had worked in the past, they saw that creeds kind of would be a stick in the mud. They were the standards by which we would be judged. In many ways, and I gave the whole dissertation last week, dealing with creeds and our 28 fundamentals. In many ways, our 28 fundamentals are such a creed. We showed some flexibility in this last general session to be able to add another fundamental. So it's not as carved in stone as, say, some of the older creeds. However, we really didn't put anything new in. It was something we've always believed to begin with. Correct. Right. And a lot has, in fact, when they developed the original 27, the panel that was working on it, they could have made it 30. They could have made it 15. And it all had to do with how they wanted to denote the basic beliefs of Adventism. So it was kind of almost arbitrary how they wanted to set it up. It ended up with 27, and then this last time we put the additional in, number 28. And so we see this progression here. But we do have a problem. Being a denomination, it's very easy to settle down into denominationalism. We come to church every week, we hear the sermon, we go home. Just like any other church. You know, the Lutheran church and the Methodist church down the street. The same thing. And we get caught up into that aspect. And our monies that we give, you know, pay for the pastor, pay for the building and the structure and the lights. And we're caught up into that day-to-day business of denominationalism. We lose track of what we were really called for. I try to stress that we were organized not as a denomination, but simply so that we as a movement could have some control over the moving forward of the message. That's its grand purpose. Adventism is not its institutions. It's not its number of publishing houses or hospitals that we have. That is not what Adventism is about. Those statistics really should be of minor importance compared to who we were really called to be. And so as we moved into the book, I think it's chapter 4 is where it began. The first question has to do is, what is Adventism, or what is Adventist in Adventism? This begins to really separate us out, because about 100 years later, that question is asked again, and we're going to deal with that. Why would they ask, why would this be important at this time? These people were coming out of a movement that had, in essence, failed. Its prime essence was the coming of Jesus in 1844. And Jesus didn't come. And if Jesus didn't come, would you say that was a success? We were, in essence, looking at it as a human being, we're founded on a failure. Didn't happen. Most of the people in 44, half of the group, went back to their original churches or gave up religion altogether. And most of the other half, from October of 44, by the spring, April of 45, had been met together in Albany, New York, to discuss what we're going to do. In the meantime, there was a breakdown in the group. These people had been isolated because of the message of Christ soon coming. The churches had shut them out. Just months before, we had the great sermon of Come Out of Babylon. So here we have people who are already isolated from the churches and from society. And now we have a small little group, which would become the Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists, who begin to examine what happened here and pull out things that set them apart from the world. What was Adventism? What was Adventist in Adventism? And they begin to denote their distinction as a little flock. This distinction with who they were, in some ways, would come back to haunt them by the 1880s. That's our next subject, our next section. Not next week. We're going to continue with this next week. But the week after that, we'll continue with the question of what is Christian in Adventism. Because now we seem to have to go back and pick that up. It seemed that we had dropped that along the way. Because we were so focused on a distinctive doctrine, we lost the commonality. We lost sight of some of that. So now we had to pick that up. And so this is where we're really at. As we begin to develop who we were as a people, all that is what made us Adventists, distinct from the other churches. We weren't just, say, another church. And that all started with Ellen's first vision. I shouldn't say started with. That was one of the early ones. This book, by the way, it all started with the disappointment, and actually probably number one we would start with was Hiram Edson. We talked a little bit about this last week. 1844, on the 23rd, the morning after. Hiram Edson, Western New York, was walking through the cornfield, and he had his epiphany. It dawned on him what had happened. The Millerites' understanding of the sanctuary was that the sanctuary was the earth. And if Daniel 8:14 was describing what would happen with the earth on the 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. How does the Bible tell us that the earth is going to be cleansed? By fire. And if you're going to cleanse the earth by fire, we're talking about the end, the consummation. So logically, Jesus has to come. It's the end of the world. So that was the main point that we had to begin to ask the question, what happened? Were we wrong on two areas? One was, were we wrong on time? Or were we wrong on the event? Because we could have been wrong on both. You know, even those who gathered at Albany, New York, had thought they were wrong on time, correct on the event, had come to the conclusion by early 45 that they could not reconcile any other time, and that their only hope was to wait for the imminent soon return of Jesus. All they could hope for. But this other small group began to have an interesting coalescence of individuals who begin to point towards something a little different, and that was judgment. When Hiram Edson had went through his cornfield and it dawned on him, he saw Jesus not coming to the earth as the sanctuary, but that the sanctuary was in heaven, and that Jesus was entering into the Holy of Holies for the first time, there to perform a work. That was the seed that began to open up. That would be the foundation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That was the foundation, the seed of what is known as the sanctuary doctrine. By December of 44, Ellen White has her first vision, a little 17-year-old girl whose family had given up the 44 movement as in the past. She has this vision about God's people traveling the path to the kingdom of heaven, to the New Jerusalem, with Jesus walking ahead, and every now and then he would raise his hand, guide the people, and the light behind them, which would light the path, was the light from the true midnight cry. Remember what the midnight cry was last week? Behold, the bridegroom cometh. Go ye out to meet him. And that was the true midnight cry, which would light our path to the kingdom of heaven. And those who would doubt it along the way, the light would go out, and their feet would stumble along the path, and they would fall off the path. The initial evidence of what this message was trying to tell them was that your experience here in 44 was valid. Don't look for another experience. Don't calculate any more time. That was valid. Now they had to understand what was the message that they evidently had lost sight of. Because Jesus certainly didn't come, and that's how they originally had interpreted it. So what happened? And with with Edson's experience, he and his friends, Kreuzer and Hahn, had gotten together, studied this thing out. Kreuzer being the teacher, a young man about 22, he was a school teacher. He wrote the article. And about 6 months later, a little more, about 6 months, in the spring of 45, it was published in a little paper called The Day Dawn. It was actually Hahn's little paper. It was their paper. About 300 people. And about a year later, it was republished as a little larger article, re-edited, and the title was The Law of Moses, and that was published in the Day Star. Enoch Jacobs was the editor of that paper, and it had about a 3,000 circulation. Well, no, that was the Albany, New York meeting, but yeah, that's the group who continued, head up by Joshua B. Himes, who continued to calculate time, or The Advent mirror was 25. The Daystar Extra was actually Jacob's Paper Daystar Cincinnati is where it comes from, hails from. For years, a century and more, all we had was the article from the Daystar. We didn't have the first article from the Day Dawn. It was an extant. We didn't know what it said. It would have been very interesting to have. And finally, someone was searching some newspapers in that area in upper New York, and they stumbled on it. These little newspapers would print their paper, and then they would do outside publishing work, and they did. And they took the paper that they published for Croiser Hahn and them, and they took that same plate, they already had it made up, and they printed it on the back page of their newspaper. It was found about 10 years ago, and just recently published in Andrews University Seminary Studies last year, autumn of 2006. So now it's extant. Now we have a copy of the original article dealing with the sanctuary. Also around that time was two people, Apollos Hale and Joseph Turner, who was beginning to understand what was happening. And they didn't invent the words either. If I can find it in here real quick. This whole book here is articles dealing with the sanctuary, by the way. The first 100 years of it. Page 21. I'm going to have to take this out of the book because this is so small. I can't read it. But Joseph Turner and Apollos Hale had also begun to understand what was happening, what was going on. And they had understood here, and this is now a small print, but it's kind of blurry, that the signs in the heavens, and did I get the right page out? Oh, here it is. This is the page. They had said that the signs in the heavens that spoke as loudly had been speakers of the falling of the stars, the darkened sun by the army of, I can't even read the words, so blurry here, were best satisfied through willingly, through unwillingly for the truth. Does it say I can't read that word here. The final line on that statement was, he says, the judgment is here. And the idea was, it was understood the 2300 days to culminate in judgment. This idea of judgment attached to the conclusion of the 2300 days is not novel and wasn't developed years later. We have some who, within the critics of the doctrine, had tried to say that the idea of investigative judgment coming in, which the term wasn't first used until 1857, that this was a latecomer, and therefore the judgment was not part of the pillar doctrine of the sanctuary because it was late. But the idea is that judgment was tied to the sanctuary right from the very beginning. Even in April of 44, Josiah Litch, our Millerite theologian, had understood this to be in context of judgment. Joseph Bates, Bill? Well, the falling of the stars were 1833. Lesbian earthquake, 1755. Dark day was 1798. May of 1798. And these were the omens that were pointing towards the soon coming. And while they had assurance in these, they knew that the culmination of 2300 days meant that Christ was in before the Father, and that judgment had commenced. Judgment time. Joseph Bates was interesting because he had understood this judgment concept to have been concluded on the 22nd of October, and that with this conclusion was the proclamation of the third angel's message to those who were already saved. This was a closed-door position, and this is what led most people to understand. The whole prophecy of the 2300 days is mirrored in the story in Matthew 25 of the 10 virgins, where they all slept. and that the bridegroom came. The call of the midnight cries, he called out, "Behold, your bridegroom cometh." As they woke up from their sleep, remember they all slept, they had to trim their lamps, put fresh oil in. Half of them didn't have oil. Not enough. And so they wanted to borrow oil from the other half. Oil we see in the Bible many times is a symbol for faith. The Holy Spirit, you're right. So they basically wanted their blessings, their experience. No one can share your experience but you. So when they went out to buy, the bridegroom came. The 5 who had oil went in, and when the others had thought they had enough oil came back, they were shut out. The door had been shut. They weren't in. So the 2300 days was understood that when it closed, the door had been shut. And it was understood to be the door of mercy. It was done. Those who were saved were saved. Those who were lost were lost. Christ would be coming imminently within just a short period of time. And the only work that the saints had was to uphold those who were already in Christ. They weren't to go out and evangelize. And of course, a lot of this attitude was already instilled with them because the world had shut them out. They were already considered the unclean, They wouldn't listen to him. So this was a time in 44 what we really commonly call the scattering time. Everybody scattered. And it was hard to even begin to talk about this message. So you only talked about it to those who were in your group. And so this idea of shut door was associated with it. And since the Joshua Behind group and most of the other group that went to Albany, New York, had said that the event didn't happen, well, then the door wasn't closed. They were the open door Adventists. And those who believed that the door was shut were called shut door Adventists. Shut door Adventists is interesting. There were several groups. George Knight denotes 2 groups in the book. And they were probably the main ones. There was one group called the spiritualizers. This has nothing to do with ghosts and demons and the spiritualists. Spiritualizers were those who believed that Jesus did come in October of 44. That he came spiritually to the heart. And they were led into a multitude of fanaticism. Some had the no work group. They weren't work. This was the Day of Atonement. This was the final judgment. And this was the symbolism was in the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement that the Jews celebrate every year. This is the great antitypical Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. And on Day of Atonement for the Jews, you didn't work. It was a Sabbath, remember? In fact, if they would have taken it literally, they didn't eat either. But these people ate. But they didn't work. The no work group. Yeah, there was all kinds of groups. There was the holy crawlers, the creepers. People would creep around like babies and children because you had to be such as little children before you could be saved. So they would be like little children. It was quite an interesting time. But this spiritualizing group finally began to fade out. She had to deal with all this. It actually, when I say the spiritualizers faded out, it found the philosophy behind it found some revision in a group a number of years later, in the late 70s, early 70s, 1870s, not 1870s, with a young man named Charles Taz Russell. Had a friend he met in the Advent Christian Church. This is a Sunday-keeping group that broke off from the Millerite Movement. This was the main body of believers with Joshua Behind. And they, with his friend Nelson Barber, wrote a book, 3 Worlds, and they had revived some of the spiritualistic idea of Jesus coming spiritually. And that's why the Jehovah's Witnesses teach today that Christ came spiritually. I think the last year they have is 1914, as he came spiritually. But before that, I think the first year was like 1878, and they have revised it several times. And this was the birth of Jehovah's Witnesses. But that all came through the Advent Christian Church. And I don't think Russell was ever a member of the Advent Christian Church. I think he associated with him. He was a young teenager at the time. I think he associated with him, but I don't think he ever became a member. Though when he departed, he took about 50 members with him to form his Bible study group, who would become Jehovah's Witnesses in the early 1900s.